your time. Better live it today. Take a stand. Meet your dreams halfway. Leave behind all the fear and doubt. And welcome to your beautiful now. Hello, everyone. Derek Floyd here, Beautiful Now Podcast. Welcome to another edition of Beautiful Now Live. This is a segment where I interview special guests and talk about things that are topical and relevant to you, your family, and your community, and how these things affect your daily life. Today's subject is super sensitive because it's been rising to the surface over the past 6 months to a year, and that is the racial tensions between our police officers or police force and our communities. How many times have you considered what it feels like to be the officer on the other end of the hate they receive? How many times have you thought about, wow, those police officers are sworn to protect us, but they battle so much from within their own community, so to speak. And for us to be able to gauge how we affect this every day, we need to be able to figure out what it means to be African American, Black, and blue, a police officer. So today's subject is being a Black police officer in today's climate. With our Capitol riots and things like George Floyd's terrible death, there's so much animosity between the police officers in our community. How can we remedy this situation? Today's guest happens to have been a police officer for over 20 years, and he has a unique perspective of how things have changed for how he was a police officer and how he did his job, sworn to protect and serve. So will you please help me welcome my good friend and mentor, Mr. Eric Lawrence. Eric, are you there, my friend?
I am here this morning. How you doing this morning, Big D?
There he is, man. How are you, brother?
I'm good. It's a beautiful morning in sunny South Florida, man.
I was going to say, you enjoying that sunshine out there.
Oh, man, do I. Most places around this time, it's still a little chilly, but here, man, God's blessed us with this sunshine, so it's always warm.
I'll take it, man. I'll take it. I miss that Florida weather sometime, but I'm all right with Charlotte out here. I'll stick tight. I'll sit tight.
How you doing up there?
Oh, I love it, man. Charlotte weather is pretty darn good, too. It's about 50-ish today, so I'll take it. No worries.
Okay. Right now, at the time of morning, it's in the mid-70s.
Oh, so see, don't even quit trying to do all that. That ain't right. You ain't got to be like that. That's okay.
I'm just trying to share the love, man. I apologize.
So, man, thanks for taking a few minutes to share some of your story. And as I said before, this is a segment that's kind of given a unique perspective to some of the racial tensions we've all been dealing with. And people need to hear a little bit more because we've got to kind of bridge the gap here. There's some missing components to make this thing change. And I think this discussion, hopefully this dialogue, will help people see there are some other answers.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that needs to be addressed. I don't think that there's been enough participation from the minority community just regarding the state of that whole law enforcement thing versus the public. So, obviously I fall into the category of being a minority, being a Black individual, and being a police officer or retired police officer relatively recently. So you've got that dynamic, and I don't think that there's been enough input from that side of the community, and I think it's kind of skewed some things. So I think it's good that we're having this dialogue.
Good, man. Good. Are there birds I hear in the background, or is that a squeak? What do I hear that back there?
Yeah, that's birds. Yeah.
I thought, do I hear birds? What do I hear out there?
I'm outside in the beautiful sunshine, man.
Okay, well, so if you guys hear birds on the camera, it's not my fault. It's birds.
I apologize.
That's all right, man. So let's go ahead and dive into this, man. Number one, you are someone who served your community for over 20 years, right? You're a retired police officer.
Retired police officer, was probably just over 23, going on 24 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So you know what it feels to be Black and blue.
Oh, yeah. That's what we put it. Yeah. I do know what it feels like to be Black and yet serve the law enforcement community and serve the public at hand. So yeah, I can speak from a position I think that a lot of the other people involved, the white officers, can't necessarily speak from.
Mm. So that means, my question starts off from the very beginning. With you being in law enforcement for over 20 years, what made you
Right.
decide to serve and protect? What was your first inkling for that?
Well, I've always been one of those people where I don't like injustice. I don't like bullies. I think it's important that we create an environment of fairness, an environment where everyone can feel as though their voice is heard, and an environment where people feel safe and people feel protected. And so it's an honor and a privilege to serve in a field where people do ultimately, they do look to the law enforcement community for service, for protection, and I would say an overwhelming majority of us for that trust that you're supposed to have from a person who's a public official. Because
Mm.
when we are selected by the public, and that's one of the reasons that I have come to really grow fond of that phrase. Let's say if you have Philadelphia, Philadelphia's finest, or Charlotte's finest, or
Mm.
Raleigh's finest, those type of things, because it really is the guys and gals behind the badge who are going out every day trying to be their best personally, and then trying to serve their best in a way that's fair across the board. And so I believe that the overwhelming majority of us, regardless of our race, have that heart. And it was for those reasons that I wanted to get involved in the
Mm.
police work. Plus, I think I might have watched a few more, too many episodes of Starsky and Hutch as a kid.
I love it. They made it look cool, didn't they?
They did. They did. Yeah. So I
Well,
think all guys have to admit that the television in Hollywood had somewhat of an influence on our decision to get involved in the law enforcement profession.
I would
You
have
know?
to say from that time
Yeah.
period for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And since when you were in the force, what was the diversity culture like? What did it like for you then?
I would say, well, my particular area, I was in a town in southern Palm Beach County where the overwhelming majority of people were whites, and the blacks were really even in a smaller minority. But as I interacted with officers from different agencies here in South Florida, I would say, I mean, obviously the minorities are minorities, so there are always going to be fewer minorities in most fields than others. But I would say that there's a good diversity of the different cultures that represent our country. There's a good diversity of blacks and Latins and so forth.
Okay, so how do you think that's changed since when you started to now, as we've grown? I mean, the diversity in the police force, I don't think is the same. No.
Well, actually, I think that the diversity, I think that the number of blacks, at least that's all my agency, had grown, or African Americans. But I think that overall, I thought that the number of people getting involved were still, I guess, was still about the same. You see those people in the Asian community who are also represented. You see other minorities, more of a Middle Eastern, who are represented. And I saw that actually grow more in the time that I was in law enforcement through the 90s and through the earlier part of the millennium.
Well, that's good. That's good to know. That's encouraging.
Yeah,
We hear so much about the white officers committing acts of racial injustice here.
sure.
Did you ever feel, as a black cop, by the folks you were trying to protect, that you were being discriminated against? Did you ever feel that on the streets?
I would say yes. I definitely felt that there's racism in our country. And so when you interact with those people from the majority, you're definitely going to encounter instances where there's some type of racial discrimination, or there's some type of racial, even profiling or racial epithets that are hurled our way. But that's just human beings being human beings as well. Because for the white officers, they incurred insults that had nothing to do with race. But when you meet people in difficult circumstances, you meet people who are at their low, they're going to lash out in different ways. But I definitely experienced that. Now, for those people who weren't necessarily going through their low, but they were just people who are more racist individuals, um, you would hear stories, and I experienced things like you go to someone's home who's contacted the police and is expecting service. And when you arrive, you interact with the person, and the person says, well, send me a white officer. Or,
Wow,
yeah, I know.
that
You hear
actually
things.
happened. Wow.
That actually happened. Yeah. And I can remember as a new officer, arresting this white female who clearly deserved to be arrested. I mean, she was acting out. I think she'd been violent in the domestic, and just arresting her with white officers, but my being the lead officer, but because I was the one actually putting the cuffs on her and placing her in the back of the patrol car, she using the N word towards me.
Oh,
Yeah, to the point where my lieutenant kind of not that he owed it to me, but kind of apologized and like, wow, Eric had a hard day because he got the lady she was actually uh, even somewhat violent and hostile towards being arrested. So I kind of had to be firm with her. But he said not only was the lady resisting arrest, but she called Eric the N word. So those are the type of things that you have to endure. But for those of us who understand what the badge is about and understand that ultimately we're law enforcement professionals, we deal with that and many more things that we just have to let roll off of our backs and keep moving forward.
and when you get treated like that, how do you bring that home? I mean, how does that make you feel as an officer sworn to protect this person? Here they are mistreating you, obviously just for the color of your skin, and you bring that home. And what do you do with that? How does that? Just what do you do with that in those terms?
Yeah, it is. It's a very difficult thing because it causes all types of thoughts to run through your mind. I mean, first you deal with the professional of, hey, listen, I'm a law enforcement professional. I have a job to do. I'm still going to make my money. I'm still going to serve the public. And so you handle it from a standpoint of professionalism. But we're human beings as well. And so looking at it, you say to yourself, okay, this person, especially if the person contacted the police and was expecting service and requested service, you say to yourself, okay, this person's calling for services and they need us. I show up, this person has no idea who I am. This person has no idea what my competencies and my capabilities, my skills are. Yet this person is going to judge me, and this person is going to put me down because of the color of my skin relative to the color of their skin. They're the ones who need the help, not me. And I've come to help this person. So it does make you feel as though, well, you know what? Maybe you don't get the help that you requested today. Maybe you deal with this situation on your own, and maybe you'll get a little bit more appreciation for the fact that someone who's a trained individual and probably a competent individual, if they continue to have and maintain their job, has showed up to help you. And so maybe you should express a little bit more gratitude. And then on a larger scale, for me, it makes me think, wow, all of my life, growing up in the 70s and the 80s, seeing the type of racial situation we have in this country, you say to yourself, the unfairness continues towards a whole people group who aren't being given a fair chance to prove themselves and yet continue to be judged by their race and the color of their skin. And there's just not justice in that regard. And so for those of us who stand for justice, it can certainly be a little bit disappointing and a little bit bothersome, the fact that there's this overall more of a big picture, sort of a macro scale of injustice that's going on that led this woman to do this.
That's so deep. And I've often wondered how the African American police officers deal with this on the street. And what a great, well thought out answer. Thank you for explaining that situation to me. I guess I go deeper by saying, we see on the news the racial disparity. That there's so many people that they call the police on minorities more than they do on our white Americans, or so on and so forth. We get the police worse in certain neighborhoods. Did you see that on the street when you were a cop, that you were called to more black people's homes than others?
I would say yes and no. And the reason I say no is from the standpoint that the majority of those people in the homes were white and non-blacks, and so the overwhelming majority of the calls were for service for whites. However, I understand exactly what you mean, and that is people with a knee-jerk reaction they'll say things like, "Oh, there's a suspicious black person in my neighborhood. Oh, there's a guy who drove by in a car. He's a black guy. Come check it out." And it's funny because when I first moved to this city, I can remember living with a friend of my family's, and this woman was white, and so she was in a very upscale white community, and I had probably been on the job for about 6 to 8 months, and I was jogging, getting some exercise through the neighborhood. So I'm jogging through the neighborhood, and one of my coworkers, he drove up beside me. He was on duty, I was off duty. So he drove up beside me, and he says, "Hey, Eric," and I go, "Hey, Bill, what's up? What's going on?" He goes, "Well, somebody said that hey, there was a suspicious black man running through the neighborhood," and so and so I and so
Wow.
I came out here and I go, wait a minute. I said, first of all, I said, what's suspicious? The fact that I'm running? It's broad daylight. It's not even evening hours. So in the middle of the day, I'm running. And because I'm black, I get called. Now, I'm a police officer, upstanding guy. And I also am a resident of the community. But because maybe someone on the other side of the community doesn't recognize me because I live on the other side, I'm a black man running. So all of a sudden, hey, there's a suspicious black man. You got to come check it out. So those type of things, man, those type of things, again, they continue to affect our country. And I think it impacts us as people who are trying to come together and be one. I think it impacts us adversely.
It just hurts my heart to continue to hear these stories from our brothers and sisters in the nation. I mean, and even like you said, you being an African American, being a police officer, knowing that this stuff happened, then have it happen to you. You're like, what? It's got to affect your psyche a little bit, you know?
Sure.
I think where I really worry, and this is, I know I asked you about this before, is with all the racial tension and the racist factions that are out there right now, all these people that are coming right to the surface, you know, are police officers trained, like physically trained in their training to deal with this kind of hate on a daily basis? Because this isn't normal that they're seeing this much hate coming at you this way. And I think it's just gotten heightened in a way.
Well, I know that when situations arise, especially those situations that are the result of current events, I know that there is typically training to say, hey, listen, this is the environment in which we're operating now, guys. This is the way we have to handle it. There's got to be a little bit more sensitivity. There's got to be a little bit more patience, because despite the substance of things, I had one boss said to me one time, and I thought it was very appropriate. This is when I was a young officer, and a sergeant of mine said, Eric, sometimes, or he said, you have to realize that sometimes the appearance of things is more important than the substance of things. And so what that sergeant meant was, you have to sometimes ask yourself, despite what's truly going on, how would this play out in the court of public opinion? And how does this look? And so you have to be sure to govern your actions to some degree based upon what the cameras are going to reveal, or what the cameras are going to say, even when there's no volume, so they can really hear because they're not close enough what's going on, or there's not enough of a history because they only started rolling the camera at a certain point in the incident. And so you missed the entire beginning of the incident. So we're definitely coached. We're definitely trained to be aware of that dynamic.
I think my question goes deeper into how do you deal with the emotion of that? Like if you're a black officer at the Capitol riot, so to speak, and there's actually racist factions there telling you they don't want you there and that you're there to protect the Capitol, but yet these people are at you. They're blaming you in front of it. You know, I'm thinking, do they train the police officers mentally how to deal with that appropriately in front of that person? You know what I mean?
Well, they teach us, and this goes across the board, and that is, we had riot training multiple times in the years that I was a police officer. What they do is they teach you that when you have people who are in your face, you stick to the letter of the law, and that is, have they committed a crime? If the people have not committed a crime, the words that come out of their mouth, whether it be racial or whether it be things about the fact that you're cops and you're pigs, pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon, those type of things that they say regarding officers, you have to let those things go by, because you have to stick to, what is my goal here this afternoon? Or what is my objective here today? And so that has to be the guiding force that causes you to react and respond. So it's definitely a self-control issue. It's definitely a training issue. But you have to realize that most police officers because of the nature of that job on a daily basis, even in small ways, have to deal with situations where can't be taken personal. It's
Mm.
not personal. This is business. This is professional. Has the person committed a crime? Has the person committed an infraction, a city ordinance, county ordinance violation? And if that person has, on what scale was it? You
Mm.
oftentimes have to judge whether or not, given the bigger picture of the incident, like the Capitol riot, is this a small infraction that doesn't warrant our attention to cause us to be distracted from the bigger issue that's going on
Mm.
here? So there's several dynamics that's flowing through an officer's mind in a situation like that.
Wow. And I just keep thinking, you guys have to be thinking so many things and have
Oh
to be
yeah,
prepared to maneuver whatever's coming. I just can't imagine what you go through to think about that. So, as always, kudos to the officers that serve us, and especially situations like that where they're up against the wall and there's a mob,
yeah,
and you're trying
for
to
sure,
protect yourself against the
for
mob,
sure,
but then you're protecting yourself against the mob, but then protecting the mob too. It's got to be a
exactly.
dichotomy in your mind there,
Yeah, that's
which brings
definitely a difficult circumstance.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Which brings me to my notes here. Another thing with, when tragedies like George Floyd happen and there's still
Mm.
things happening every day, how
Yep.
does a black officer reconcile that behavior in his own unit? Like if he was at the unit where that happened and that white officer did that, there's got to be tension in that police office between those officers together. How does he reconcile that to himself?
The way he reconciles that is the first attempt is to isolate it to an individual and not to an entire class of people or race of people. And so it's important that the white officers in that environment basically totally discredit the officer who's the culprit and disassociate themselves as far as that decision is concerned and basically condemn that officer's actions so that they let the black officers and the minority officers know, like, hey, listen, that was an individual decision. That is no way a reflection of who we are and the feelings and beliefs on the part of the rest of us. So if if the black officer doesn't get that, then it definitely causes somewhat of a conflict and a racial divide because the George Floyd situation was it was a complete it was completely mishandled. Um, Despite any type of training they may have received, I can't believe that those actions were totally consistent with any training that any law enforcement agency would provide to their officers. So I have to believe that there was some training and some policy violations and use of force violations that were committed by that officer.
And when you're in a community, if you're the police officer that was in that community, and your black counterparts and your community comes to you and says, "Hey, how did you let this happen? Why did you let this happen?" Like you said, it's hard to differentiate that it's not the whole police force. This is one single person's
Right.
action, but the community sees it as it's the police's action. How does a police officer go out and try to mend that with the community? Because they don't trust you anymore. And I'm not saying you particularly, but I'm saying when things like this happen in a community like that, the trust is broken. And how
Yeah.
do we start to remend that?
I think if we start to amend that, there has to be an agency position that comes out publicly. And that is the head of the agency, the chief of police, the city manager, the city mayor. They have to come out and they have to condemn those actions. I mean, obviously, it's a tough blend because on one hand, it's important that they support their officers and that the officers feel as though, hey, you know what? My mayor, my city manager, my chief of police backs me. But at the same time, they have to differentiate and they have to say, although we do back our officers and although we send our officers out on the streets to do a tough job that none of us at the top are out on the street doing at the moment, while we send them out, they have to have the confidence that we're 100% behind them because they're the ones in the fire, they're the ones in the arena. And we trust them, we train them, we give them the equipment, we give them the authority, we give them the law to be able to use force, to be able to injure, to even be able to take a life if necessary. But on the other hand, when they see those type of actions, they have to call out improper behavior, they have to condemn it, and they have to show that it was swiftly and it was properly dealt with. So it starts at the top, and then the officers on the street have to go the extra mile to show people, hey, when I show up, I'm here to serve and protect, just like the side of the patrol car says. I'm here to serve the community and do a job that most people aren't necessarily wanting to do. And I'm here to protect you, to make sure that you feel safe, that there's nothing that's going to cross that thin blue line between chaos and anarchy and between a civilized society, that nothing's going to cross that on my watch without me intervening and addressing that. So it's important that the officers be able to show up and in a diplomatic and in a connecting way, communicate that to the people who, especially those people who are adversely impacted, because there are a lot of non-blacks who frowned upon that as well. But especially when it comes to the black community, making sure that that message is communicated. And then as a black officer, making sure you say, yeah, you know what? I felt it too. I felt it too. Number one, I felt it as an officer who's a professional. I felt the tarnishing of the badge that brought, that brought a black eye on a very, what I feel is a very dignified profession. So as a black officer, I felt that. But also what I felt was, I felt it personally as a black man, that this is the type of thing that happens unfairly, happens in our society towards those who look like us. And at given a different time in a different place, being off duty, being on vacation, being in another city, who knows if something like that couldn't happen to me? Just because I happen to have, as you saw from the example of my running through my neighborhood, just because I happen to have the badge in my pocket, and just because I happen to also serve and protect behind the badge, if I'm not dressed in blue at the moment, I might be the victim of those things as well. And we've had that. The discussion with black officers in the agency being racially profiled, especially in situations like traffic stops, that has happened to us. And sometimes it's even happened in our own jurisdiction, our own city, that when the officer pulls the black officer over, and then the black officer says, hey, man, what's going on? What'd you stop me for? Well, I stopped you for this. No, that wasn't the case. You saw a black face and you stopped me. Then when you rolled up and you saw who it was, now you're backpedaling. So those type of things happen as well.
Wow. And you just brought a point that I was going to mention, which is, do you feel like is reverse racism, so to speak, black officers pulling over black people, that they think just because they've been told so much by the media and by what our country is kind of fed into our brain, so to speak, okay, that black man shouldn't be there, he's in the wrong place. So the black police officer pulls him over and realizes, wait a minute, I'm racial profiling. Do you think that happens?
I think that does happen to a small degree periodically. I think it happens less with those people who are part of it happens less with black people black officers doing that to the members of the community who are African-American members of the community. But yeah, sure, I think it does happen. But one of the things that I've said to people with respect to, the whole profiling issue is that there is the aspect of profiling, and that's very true, and that's a very real thing. But at the same time, there is a thin line between profiling someone and drawing on your experiences in certain situations. And what I mean by that is, we know that with regard to violent crime, that men are going to be apt to commit violent crime more than women. That younger people are going to be apt to commit at least violent street crime more than older people. Now, I think that when it comes to black and white, I think that's when you have to be very careful, because you can't say, well, blacks are more apt to commit this crime than whites. Now, with that said, there are some areas where you can say, okay, because it falls in both blacks and whites. Blacks are more apt maybe to, in this town, in this area, blacks are more apt to be doing this than whites. But you have to be very careful when it comes to profiling, not to go solely based on that. What I mean by that is, when I was a young officer, probably in my first 2 years, we did reverse sting operations. And so I posed as, along with our vice unit, I posed as, hey, I'm just a young black dude on a bike selling crack. And the guy I was actually riding on handlebars. And the guy who was pedaling the bike was a police sergeant. I was a police officer. And what would happen is people would drive into the community. Hey, let me get some of that. And I'd be, hey, what you want? And so I'd jump off the bike. I'd go over to a certain location and meet the person. I'd sell them the would-be crack. And then they would drive off. And then once they drove off, I pull out my radio. I give a vehicle description. I give an occupant description and a direction of travel. And so the guys who were waiting in the bushes would then surround that car, pull over that car for a traffic stop, and then an arrest would be made for attempt to purchase crack cocaine. This is back in the early 90s.
Wow.
Because what we were selling them was soap.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
Well, because we're not going to sell them actual drugs because it's illegal to sell drugs.
Right.
So
right,
you've got two cops on a bicycle selling them. Now, here's the thing. Here's the point I'm trying to get to. The overwhelming majority of people who rode up in the hood were white people.
Wow.
So you got white people from this affluent town riding up in the hood. Okay, they see two blacks on a bike. Oh, they must be. Hey, they're selling. So hey, where can I get some of this or whatever? So hey, I'm a black man. The sergeant's a black man. So I'm in street clothes. He's in street clothes. So we jump off. Hey, we do the deal. Boom. So my point is that when I see someone driving a certain type of vehicle coming to the hood and they're white, now, is it possible that they're there to visit their dear friend? Yes, that is possible. However, especially on that Friday and Saturday night doing the sting operation, I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of people who fit that, if you want to call it a profile, were there to make an attempt to purchase crack cocaine. And so when they first drove into the neighborhood, although I didn't say, hey, with 100% certainty, that person's here for illegal activity, I did say, okay, this is probably one of those. And in the majority of circumstances, because they fit the profile, it was one of those. And that person was white. So that person could say, hey, I was racially profiled because I was white. Were they racially profiled? Or based upon the vehicle they were driving, the time of day they were there, and based upon their race, yes. Did I draw in history and say, okay, there's a high probability that that person's here making an attempt to purchase crack cocaine? Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, and such a depth to how you explain that. So I appreciate you just walking through the whole process and making us realize how hard it is to do this job on the street and have to figure out, like you said, your experience to what the profile may be, to using all the tactics you've learned. And it's just got to be a tough thing. So again, I'm only doing this program too just because I want people to know there's another side to this that the officers need to be explained for too. I mean, we hear such negative, but you're explaining this job is not easy. And sometimes mistakes are made, but you're doing it for the cause.
We're doing it for the cause. And one of the things that I can say in almost 24 years I was involved in law enforcement, one of the things that allowed me to go home day after day over the course of that almost 24 years and have a sense of satisfaction and gratification was that at the core of it, I'm part of a team of people that numbers almost 1 million across this nation who do a job that our society desperately needs done. And it's a difficult job. It's a job, and many times that's thankless. And what I mean by that is oftentimes there's thanklessness both within the agency and without the agency. And that is when you're on the street and you show up at a call, people see you. They don't necessarily connect with you or identify you with you as a person. What they want to know is, can you help me? Can you solve my problem? What can you do for me? And so the level of service that you give in doing that for them is going to formulate their opinion of the police and then of you as a particular officer. Within the agency, they want to know, okay, did you go out today and do your job? Did you do it well? Did you protect the city or the county's liability in that you didn't do something that's going to get us sued? And also, did you genuinely treat people? Because believe it or not, most law enforcement executives are interested in, hey, I want a good police department. I want a good sheriff's office. And so I do want you to give respectful, good service to the public, because the majority of the public are just good, honest, hardworking, tax-paying Americans who, by the way, pay our salaries, who just want to do what everybody else does, which is they want to live their life, pursue their dreams, They want their family to be provided for. They want to be protected, and they just want to go about their business. And when they need us, we provide the service. Hopefully, it was a good interaction and a good connection. And then we go our way. And we continue to do that for all of those within the 8 hours or 10, 12 hours of our shift. So as a police officer, it's difficult because outside the agency, what can you do for me? Inside the agency, hey, did you make sure you do your job and protect the city and the county's liability and do it in a manner that's professional and cast us in a positive light so we can continue to effectively connect with the community and serve the public. So it's a tough job. It's a tough job. And it's a job whereby, unlike those people who are in our cousins in the fire and medical services response, they show up, they're the rescue heroes because they show up to help you in ways where that particular family or individual needs some help. And so they show up non-biased, how can I help you? Whereas in law enforcement, we also show up to help, but in order for me to help person A, then I've got to come down on person B. So person B and their connected people, they're not going to be happy with me. So when you play that role of law enforcement officer, there's always that difficult dynamic that you have to consider, that you're going to do a great and outstanding job, but invariably there are going to be people who are not happy in a majority of the situations. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, man. This is such good information. I hope everybody that's watching is really taking this to heart and looking at your police officers in a completely different way. And I love that you keep saying we're coming to do a service. I've never really thought about police officers as coming to do a service for me, but that's exactly what they're coming to enforce the law, whatever that is around the situation.
Right.
Their service is to enforce whatever the law says about that situation. And I never even really considered it as a service, but it is. So, that's amazing. And I'm gonna really register that when I see police officers come out and do what they do. I'm gonna say, okay, they're here to service. They're here. You said they call for a service. That is such a unique perspective. So I'm gonna keep that.
As a matter of fact,
go ahead.
I was going to say, as a matter of fact, that's the way, at least in South Florida, that's the way it's actually labeled. And that is, they will say, okay, within, let's say for the year of 2020, how many calls for service did this agency receive? Or officer, how many calls for service did you handle today? Sure. So within the industry, when we receive calls, whether it be to the non-emergency or the emergency number, it is considered a call for service. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm going to pull us back just a little bit from when we first started talking, and I said, what made you become or want to become a police officer? And you mentioned it was, a little bit of police shows back in the day, Starsky and Hutch, and how in those days, 60s, 70s, 80s, police officers were looking at a different light. They were shown in a different way. And it made young African Americans want to be a police officer. But now, how does that affect what these young kids are seeing now? Because I'm thinking if I was a young black man now, a young black boy, would I want to be a police officer? Probably not, because of all the disdain that's shown from the media, from those around us saying, hey, you don't want to be that, those guys are bad. They come in here and rest my neighborhood. That's going to affect diversity in the police department eventually. No? Am I saying that wrong?
I agree with you. I would say within the last 2 years, what you've seen played out in the media probably has affected the desire on the part of the African American community to become involved in law enforcement. And I say that because I have two sons, and I had spoken with them with respect to their involvement in the law enforcement community. And my son, he'll be 20 years old next month, he was saying, like, Dad, I don't think I want to do that, because the local guys in blue, as opposed to the federal law enforcement officers, who most of them don't even wear uniforms, the local guys in blue aren't looked upon too fondly by the athletes up here in school, because my son's a football player at a university here in Florida. So I said, wow. I said, man, I that's always been a dynamic. It has been young guys. And again, why? Why is there such an apprehension on the part of young guys to be police officers? Again, because young guys are going to, because many times they're things in which they're involved, even if it's just speeding, even if it's just a traffic violation, Younger guys are going to have more of a negative interaction with police, and young guys are going to tend to feel as though their manhood is being at least challenged by having a police officer interact with them. So I get that. That's always been a dynamic with young men, but it just seems now, specifically in the African American community, there could be less of a desire to get involved in the law enforcement community, and that's really too bad. That's really too bad.
I mean, because I think especially as you're explaining it now, and this is how I've been looking at it, is that if these young black boys now, the smaller boys, 10, 12 years old, that are coming up, that this is when they're grooming toward that career, if they don't want to go into that career, when we start talking about diversity in the police department in the coming years, we're not going to have diversity because the African Americans don't want to do that anymore. And then we're going to be upset because there's no black officers, but yet we told our black kids, don't be police officer because they're bad. So we can't have both ways here. Something's going to have to change in the culture in order for us to get diversity in our coming police department. You know what I mean?
You're 100% right. One of the things I've challenged people who are critical about something, I've said, well, listen, get involved and show us how to do it right. If you have an issue with it, get involved and show us how to do it correctly. Get involved and show us how to do it properly, because there's always room for someone who is good at their profession within that profession, regardless, whether it's teaching, whether it's medical, whether it's police work, whether it's pastoring, whether it's somebody who's actually hosting podcasts. There's always an opportunity for someone to come into that field and be an example, be a model, to be someone where people go, yes, I like that. That's what it's supposed to be. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. And you know what? We're getting to the close. We've talked a little longer than we normally do, but I just sure appreciate you taking the time to break this down.
Yeah.
You know, I love the subscribers. Hope you guys are enjoying this. This is just such good information. And the last question, which is something I guess you and I talked about multiple times, you know, you are a great man of character, of honor. You know, one of the few good men out there that I know that I could say, that's a good man. Not to mention that you're a good man in blue, but you're a good man, period. What's the next step as a nation that we can take to kind of reset the narrative of the police officer, especially the black police officer? How can we reset that for the kids that are watching, for the nation that's watching? Because this is where we are now, and we're going to have to do something to change the culture to make sure that police officers are respected again for the service that they do.
I would say Hollywood plays a big role. You know that so much of our so much of our impression regarding most things come through what do we see when we watch television? What do we see when we watch a movie? What do we see that's not Hollywood, but things that are posted on YouTube. So I would say that's one thing. But from the actual industry of people, I would say that just like back in the 90s, something called community policing was big, at least it was here in Florida, that they have different, I would say, initiatives within the police department to try to reach out to the community and let the community know, hey, listen, we have always, long before this incident happened, we have always had a standard of we're here to serve and protect. So we want to tell them, hey, we want to revisit that. We want to continue that. There's always going to be bumps in the road. There's always going to be hiccups along the way. But just like the days of Reed and McCoy and the black and white out there in Southern California, Adam 12, all the way
Adam
to today.
12.
That's a blast from the past. I was a little guy.
You took me back on that one, bro. You took me way back.
But on the side of that vehicle, we're here to serve and protect. And that's way, way back in the day, all the way to today, where they're watching these television shows that are going to be on tonight. And each night of the week. And that is, hey, listen, we are here to serve and protect. We apologize for the negativity and the black eye that some officers might provide the community, but that doesn't represent the overwhelming majority of us. We're just like you. We're hardworking, tax-paying Americans who want to come to work every day, do a good job for our bosses, to serve in the way we're supposed to serve, which ours is to serve the public, and that you might be the recipients and the beneficiaries of our service, and hopefully you'll have good things to say. And so let them know we're here for you, and see how it goes.
Wow. Man, I have just learned so much from today, and I've known you for years, but I never knew everything that you went through the job that you were doing. And I've watched the media, watched the news, I see YouTube channel, I see all of what's being fed at me. But hearing it from perspective of where you sit now, I have a whole clearer picture than what's going on out there. And I really, I send our love and prayers to all the boys in blue out there, white and black, all of them that are serving for us, because I understand deeper now what you face every day. And that you are offering a service to us, to protect us, to serve us, to make sure that we are safe, to abide by the law. So it's just such an enormous respect now that I've always had, but that deeper respect today, just hearing what you've talked about. So thank you so much for sharing.
And I do have to listen. Anytime I get a public forum, I do have to say this, and that is, I know that for me, a large majority of the part of the time that I was a police officer, I was also a believer in God. And so on a deeper level, understanding that it's the character of the man or the woman who's in the uniform that's going to ultimately come out and be the individual who's at that call at the time. And so understanding that as a child of God, that there's a certain way that God calls us to think, and there's a certain way God calls us to act. And when you realize that my number one audience is an audience of one, because I love Jesus and I want to do the right thing, then that's going to guide my actions just as much, if not more, than agency policy and the law. Because the law and agency policy allows for a lot of discretion out there where you could try to construe things a certain way and then write the documents to reflect it. But when you're somebody who says, listen, I love God and I'm doing the right thing, it's all things above board. So I would say the number one thing that people need, whether they're in a blue uniform or whether there's somebody who's flipping burgers at McDonald's, and that is, hey, we all need Jesus, brother.
Amen to that, man. Amen to that. Well, I sure do appreciate everyone that's watched this segment today. I hope you've enjoyed and got a lot of great information that you can share with friends and family. This is the kind of segment that we need to let other people see, because so many people are struggling with this situation of being black officer in America and how the racial tension has built up. And what do we see in our officers today? So this is a great time, a great chance to share something positive about what's going on. So please take the time to do that. Share with a friend, share with the community. And as always, we look forward to seeing you again at the Beautiful Now Live podcast. Have a great one, guys. Take care. God bless.